idea that the punishment for idolatry is not just death. That's not enough. It involves visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. This is a prescription for genocide. It means cutting off the reproduction of a people. Now, idolaters are not merely to be killed, not just dead, but their children, their women, and their children's children. The moral side of idolatry is, of course, completely out of control. It's associated with everything from adultery, whoring after strange gods, to superstition, to mere metaphysical error. It's linked with, just to give a short list, materialism, hedonism, fornication, black magic, sorcery, demonology, bestiality, cults, Roman emperors, and divination. This bewildering array of evils resolves itself into two basic varieties, which frequently intermix. The first is the condemnation of idolatry as error, as stupidity or a false deluded belief. The second is the darker judgment that the idolater actually knows that the idol is a vain, empty thing, but he continues to cynically exploit it for the purposes of power or pleasure. So, there are two kinds of idolaters, the knaves and the fools, as we would say in the 18th century, but overlap and cooperation between the two kinds. Now I want to take the third aspect of idolatry, what I would call the operational. Because the subtle distinctions of doctrine, of theology, I think, often miss what the practical, the practice of anti-idolatry, of iconoclasm, involves. There's, for instance, an important difference between heretics or apostates within the iconoclastic community or non-idolatrous community and unbelievers who live outside that community. But there's even a more straightforward approach, and that is not so much to focus on what idolaters believe or what iconoclasts believe that they believe, what we call secondary beliefs, attribute to other people beliefs, as now, for instance, it is being attributed to Muslims that they are all enemies of this country. And by people who used to, like Newt Gingrich, used to have a brain, but I have not seen much evidence of it lately. So, secondary belief, let's forget about beliefs for a moment. Let's ask, what do idolaters do, and what is done to them by iconoclasts? Sometimes the question of belief converges with actions and practices. For instance, iconoclasts tend to believe that in addition to their wrong-headed beliefs, idolaters commit unspeakable acts, such as cannibalism and human sacrifice. That's the little Hollywood version. There's always some virgins being trooped up in front of the idol to be slaughtered. But the curious thing is that this secondary belief then justifies equally unspeakable acts of violence against the idolaters. Not only can and must they be killed, but their women and children have to be massacred as an expression of the vengeance of the one true God. So there's a kind of fearful symmetry between the terrible things idolaters are supposed to do and what may be done to them in the name of divine justice. And I think the sacrifice of children is one of the things that is always attributed to idolaters and that then turns out to be okay for the iconoclasts to impose on them. And we'll see this coming up in actually in Poussin's paintings in a few minutes. Another key to thinking pragmatically about idolatry is to ask not just how idolaters live, but where they live. Idolatry is deeply connected to the question of place, the territorial imperatives dictated by local deities who declare that certain tracts of land are not only sacred, but uniquely promised to them. Indeed, you could rewrite the history of biblical idolatry and iconoclasm as a set of territorial war stories. Wars fought over the possession of land. The best book I know on idolatry, Moshe Halbertal and Yavishai becomes clearest, so the Holy Land. And Al-Qaeda's main, if you ask, what does Al-Qaeda think it's doing? It certainly has very little interest in destroying our values. What it does want to do is to drive us out of the Middle East. It wants us to leave Saudi Arabia, Iraq, to have no place in the Middle East, which is, they regard as their holy land. So, in that sense, it's a totally intelligent thing, whether you agree with it or not. Not the point. It really is about territory and the holiness of the place. And this becomes clearest when one considers the practical enforcement of the ban on images, which involves destroying the sacred sites of native inhabitants, leveling their high places, and destroying their graven images and idols. The link between territoriality and idolatry becomes even more explicit when it's invoked as an insuperable objection to any negotiations or treaties. As Albert Hall and Mark Lee point out, to make a deal with an idolater, especially about land, is to fall into idolatry oneself. So the only politics really possible between the iconoclast and the idolater is total war. So, to sum up, idols are something like condensations of radical evil in images that must be destroyed, along with those who believe in them, by any means necessary. There's no idolatry without iconoclasm to label it as such, since, very important, you notice idolaters never call themselves idolaters. They just say, well, I have certain values. I value this. And it could be a word, it could be a concept, it could be a person, an image, a golden calf. What idolaters say is, I worship Baal, or Dagon, or Caesar, or maybe money. But it's not idolatry. It's just a normal form of piety within my community. That's why market fundamentalism is such a kind of familiar religion. And we know what it has as its idol at the center. But they don't, of course you're not going to call it idolatry, because idolatry is a polemical term. It fits in the mouth of the iconoclast. So iconoclasm mirrors its own stereotype of idolatry and its emphasis on human sacrifice and terrorism. The latter understood as violence against the innocent, the staging of spectacular acts of symbolic violence and cruelty. Terrorist acts which cost innocent human lives, shock and awe, our version of that time. Now, all these are barbaric practices I'm talking about, radical evil condensed around images. But that's not the only place this rhetoric of iconoclasm operates. Another place we would have to notice it is in the whole tradition of modernist critical iconoclasm. I'm not going to linger over this, but important to recognize that critique as such has often been associated with an act of iconoclasm, with destroying false images, all the way from Francis Bacon's denunciation of the idols of the marketplace, the theater, the cave, and the tribe, to the evolution of a Marxist critique of ideology that builds on the rhetoric of iconoclasm. Iconoclasm can be sublimated. Clement Greenberg's denunciation of kitsch as the religion of the Philistines, and the word Philistine, of course, immediately suggests that mass culture is the site of idolatry and must be overcome. And Adorno's account of the culture industry continually invoke this kind of rhetoric. Now, happily, they don't go out to kill people over this. The idea is rather to kill certain ideas or to kill certain cultural practices. The end point of this, of course, is probably the greatest of the critical iconoclasts of my time, Jean Baudrillard, and the evil demon of images, which he continually waged war against. But the greatest break, I think, the most profound critique of idolatry and iconoclasm is Nietzsche's late work, Thus Spake Zarathustra. So let's move on to Nietzsche. Nietzsche turns iconoclasm, like so many other things, upside down and against its own roots in the authority of the law. The only thing the iconoclast Zarathustra smashes are not images, but the tablets of the law. He says, break, you lovers of knowledge, the old tablets. Break the old tablets of the never gay, inscribed with prohibitions against sensuous pleasure, by pious killjoys who slander the world and tell men, thou must not desire. The only law Nietzsche will tolerate is a positive, thou shalt. He enjoins us to write anew upon new tablets the word noble, and he criticizes the Manichaean moralism of the priestly lawgivers who divide the world into good and evil. And here's from Zarathustra. O my brothers, who represents the greatest danger for all of man's future? Is it not the good and the just? Inasmuch as they say and feel in their hearts, we already know what is good and just, and we have it too. Woe unto those who still seek it. And whatever harm the evil may do, the harm done by the good is the most harmful harm. The good must be Pharisees, they have no choice. The good must crucify him who invents his own virtue. The Creator they hate most. He breaks tablets of old values. They crucify him who writes new values on new tablets. Now, so far as I know, Nietzsche never explicitly mentions the second commandment, but it is the unspoken center of his great 1888 text, The Twilight of the Idols, which could be mistaken for a fairly conventional iconoclastic critique. Remember, it opens by promising to philosophize with a hammer, to declare war, as he says, not just on the idols of the age, but the eternal idols. Sounds very much like traditional critical iconoclasm. But then Nietzsche turns the tables on both the ancient and modern iconoclasts and on the second commandment by renouncing the very idea of image destruction at the outset. The eternal idols, he says, are not to be smashed, but to be